As a 43-year-old white male in the United States, the following conversation can get a little uncomfortable, and I think that's where I want to be. As I'm looking at the black and white issues that I've seen in my past, this one stands out a little bit because I didn't have to grow up with it. I didn't really see it. It's just something I never had to deal with. But race is really important in our country today. And it is not a black and white issue. It is a gray issue. And this week, I am talking to Dr. Tracey Benson. Tracey Benson is the founder of the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute and wrote a book, co-authored a book, Unconscious Racial Bias in Schools, a developmental approach to exploring race and racism. His research focuses on addressing structural and systematic racism in K-12 school systems. He has committed his career to leading for change, courageously addressing entrenched practices that impede lifetime outcomes of students of color, and coaching leaders towards implementing anti-racist, anti-bias policies and curriculum in K-12 schools. Now, Tracey's research focuses on the school system, but I think you can extrapolate out some of his teachings and thinkings to the world at large that we live in. And it was a really good conversation. It was a candid conversation. And I would ask you, if you choose to listen on, that you will listen to this talk with an open mind. Just check some of those impulsive thinkings that you and I tend to have. So enjoy this conversation with Dr. Tracey Benson. Well, thank you for joining me today, Dr. Benson. Is it Doctor or Tracey? Which one works best for you?
Mr. Benson.
Okay.
No,
I know you're a teacher, but we don't know each other. But I reached out to you. I was looking for a guest for the podcast to talk about race and how it affects our culture. And I actually Googled race podcast Charlotte, North Carolina. And the podcast you did with Better Leaders, Better Schools popped up as the first result back. And I listened to that and I was like, this is the guy I want to talk to. And just to give you a little bit about where I'm coming from, I grew up outside of Baltimore, Maryland, but the area I grew up in was 90% white. I went to an all-boys Catholic school in Baltimore that was 75% white, and in a neighborhood that was 75% black. I went to James Madison University, which again was about 75% white. We moved here to Charlotte. My wife and I have 8 children. We homeschool. We're Christian. And just kind of, if you listen back to some of the other podcasts that I've done, kind of see where I was ideologically. The things that have been front and center in the news lately, George Floyd, Ahmaud Arbery, and many, 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 many more, has just got me thinking, something's not going on. Something is going on here, and I don't think it's very good. So it just got me looking to learn. So that's what we're doing here today. I'm here to learn. I've listened to about 30% of your book, the podcast and your TED Talk, and you talk about a couple things that I would see as origin stories. The one would happen when you were a student, one would happen when you were a principal. Would you say that that's where you want to? Can you give me the origins of where your life's work started and and why you've dedicated yourself to it?
Gotcha. Well, first, thanks for having me on, Steve. It was a cold call, and I'm like, let me listen to one of your podcasts. Sounds good. Let's go on. Let's talk to this guy. I like Celebrate the Gray because I believe the space of, race in society is a very gray space, right? That we often like to make it like a polar space. It's what's divided our country right now, and it's a very bad thing for everybody, right? But it's interesting to hear you talk about your background because our backgrounds are amazingly similar. I'm not from Baltimore, but I'm from Milwaukee, Wisconsin.
Mhm.
And the schools I went to growing up, starting in the third grade, I went to a Catholic school for my first and second grade years, which was a school that was 65% white. We had all white nuns who taught us when we were there, all my brothers and sisters. But then in the third grade, I was enrolled in a program. My mother enrolled myself, my brother and sisters in a program called the 220 program. It was a program to integrate the suburban schools. And so I was bussed out from third grade until all the way through high school to a school that was 90+% white.
Hmm.
I went to the University of Wisconsin-Madison. I was one of the very few black males who did not play a sport, who went to school just on an academic scholarship. I got my master's at University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, again, a predominantly white institution. I got my doctorate from Harvard. And so I've been in predominantly white spaces for these educational experiences for the majority of my life. And also my neighborhood in which I grew up in was on the north side of Milwaukee. And it was the most racially mixed space that you'd probably find in Milwaukee. Milwaukee, Wisconsin has been either number one or number two for the most segregated city in the U.S. for decades at this point. And so we have relatively similar upbringings, but the difference is that we are of different races, right? Different ethnic origins, right? But we grew up in a similar environment. And what I think gets us to this point in our lives at different stages is the ways in which our environments interact with us. Right? How does my predominantly white environment interact with me? I assume it interacts with you in a particular way, but you're of the dominant culture, and dominant culture and don't really need to think about what it means to be different in that space. Me, different skin color, different background, different ways of thinking, knowing funds of knowledge. The environment acts differently towards me in terms of based on basically my visual representation, which is a black male. And so I had several points in my life where you had to learn what it means to be a black person in society, because kids aren't born with really the understanding of what it means to be a white person, black person, Asian person. But through the way in which society interacts with you, you learn what it means to be you. And several points in my life, very early on, in elementary school, it's very painful to learn that you are a black person with relation to the society in which you live in. Right. And just imagine, that the innocent, and you have 8 kids, picture their innocence. They're young, they're toddlers, they're young students in the first, second, and third grade. And they have to learn through their curriculum that their people were enslaved for hundreds of years. They had never known this before, right? I think everyone's the same, but you actually have to learn that just because of your skin color, you were enslaved, you were beaten, you were murdered, you were raped, you were kept from education, you were seen as less than human for hundreds of years because of your skin color. That's a very painful learning for Black people. And we have to learn that early. We learn that through curriculum. We learn that as like a normal part of what America is. And so these racial awakenings happen, through our curriculum, but also through the ways in which society acts towards us. We see on television, when we're watching movies as kids. It was way worse when I was a kid, that representations in cartoons were all white, all white representations, unless you're like Bugs Bunny or someone like that, right? And protagonists in movies were white people. What's that movie called with Chadwick Boseman? The
Black Panther.
Black Panther was such a groundbreaking hero movie, because that was the first time we ever saw a majority Black protagonist cast. And that's in the late it was like 2018, 2019. And so learning what it means to be someone who's minoritized, not a minority, but minoritized in society, has brought me to the point of really wanting to alleviate the oppression of others who look like me.
And yes, it's easy to go through life as a white guy that I didn't have to think about it. And I've heard it said, white people have the privilege of walking away from this conversation or deciding not to have this conversation, but it's not that easy for you. So that takes me to listening to your book. You wrote your book with Sarah Fireman, who's a white principal. I think you were working with her at Harvard, as I remember, and it seemed I got the feeling of you had to take time out of your day and your schedule and your life to teach this person that they were being racist and how not to be racist. And it seems a weird thing, and I've heard this talked about, and some people will say, it's not my job to teach you about this. Go learn it for yourself. But you've basically made it your life to teach people that what you're doing is not okay. And let me give you some tips and some tools to not be racist. Where I've heard it said sometimes it's not my job to do that. Why do you think that was important for you? Why'd you make that such a big part of your life?
Yeah, in my everyday life, I have a very small circle of friends that are mostly people of color, right? Because in my circle, I'm a husband, I'm a father, and I need to have my psychologically free space in order just to be a person, right? Do the things that people do, and not constantly talk about the dynamics of race. And so, in my personal life, I keep a very close knit circle of majority people of color, not out of any sort of sense of I dislike white people, but when it comes to like the sort of unintentional normalized racism that enters the space, um, when you're in interracial relationships, it can produce a certain amount of psychological stress for the person of color, right, or the person who is othered, right. I have a lot of friends who are LGBTQ, right, and they have majority of friends who are LGBTQ, and very few. I'm often their only straight friend, right, because there's a certain amount of stress involved in always having to explain your choices, who you are, and what you do, right, when you're being othered, right. And so my space in my personal life is very small and very tight in terms of who I interact with and who I interact and bring into my family circle. However, in my professional life, my purpose in life is to alleviate the oppression on people of color. Right. And
Mm-hmm.
so what I have to understand in order to be able to do that in our current society is I have to work with the dominant racial group. And that's mostly white people who own power, and also those who support this infrastructure of white supremacy. And white supremacy, when we use that word, it's like, oh my God, I'm not a white supremacist, I don't hate anyone. I don't mean white supremacist. White supremacy is the belief that white people know better and are more intellectually sound and capable and smarter, and ways of life knowing and doing the forms of knowledge are better than that of any other race, especially Black people. We have to understand that that's the foundation of our country. In order
Mm-hmm.
for a group of folks to come over to another land where people live and say, we're gonna steal your land, we're going to eliminate you, and those who we don't eliminate, we're going to assimilate into our culture. That is white supremacy. We are essentially better than you, right?
Yeah.
And then to follow that, to then enslave another group of people because of their skin color to work for us, to build our country, and to keep you enslaved with impunity is a way that we are better than you. We don't see you as equal to us. That is white supremacy. And this has been a residual of our country that we're still reconciling with today. We've been in hundreds of years of very explicit laws and practices that have dehumanized Black and brown folks, right? And even though the civil rights movement happened in 1965, that doesn't mean racism was solved just back then. We have to realize how close 1965 the civil rights movement was until today. It's only 57 years ago,
Mm-hmm.
right? Opposed to
Yes.
hundreds of years of very real violent oppression. And so right now, the residuals, we're still dealing with that as a country. We can see us sort of trying to work our way through what does it mean to usurp white supremacy. And so why I've dedicated my life to this is because I believe that there's a better way. I've been an educator, and I choose education as my mode of intervention is because I've been a teacher, and I see the ways in which education can be used for empowerment and used for liberation for people of color. And as a teacher and as a principal and as an AP, and even as an academic, that I believe the more we understand the ways in which the system of education has been built on this foundation of white supremacy, that has several practices and ways of being and doing that oppresses people of color, and way I help folks understand the ways in which these practices work and how to then usurp them. Right. For instance, the discipline system is also often disproportionately applied to people of color, specifically Black and brown boys, in a way that's more
Mm-hmm.
punitive than their white male counterparts. Being that because, in society we have developed this trope of the criminalized Black person, right? Which is not a trope that sticks often to white males, right? White males are
Mm-hmm.
allowed to be individuals. Like just a few days ago, a white male went in and shot up a grocery store, right? And
Mm-hmm.
he's an individual, but we don't attach them to Dylan Roof. We don't attach them to the Unabomber. We don't attach them to Ted Bundy. This history of very violent white males that we have in our society that do very bad things. He gets to be
Mm-hmm.
his individual who has a mental health issue, not like other white men. But black and brown
Mm-hmm.
folks, if we do something just like that, we're attached to the rest of the group, and the rest of the group is criminalized because they're a criminal people, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And so by helping administrators and teachers understand that this very trope of the criminalized black person exists in schools, which then results in higher levels of discipline being doled out to black and brown people because of these unconscious biases towards them, helps people reflect on that if we are not going to give one of our white students this level of consequence for this action, we should not do that as well to these black and brown students. And so that is my life's work. That's what I intend to do. And in my time here, I won't be able to solve racism, but hopefully I'll be able to bring people to a level of consciousness who are educators who have control of students' learning
Mm-hmm.
to a place where they understand that they have to work on alleviating their biases so they don't continue to affect students in their school building.
Yes. And the generational, the distance between even slavery, you mentioned civil rights, which is 1965, but you take that back to 1865. And, my grandparents were born in the, 1910s. So in their lifetime, they met I'm sure they could have met a slave, somebody so that's, a couple generations back where we had slavery in this country. And then you take Jim Crow and the detention system and the penal, people would argue that there's still some of that going. Slavery is still happening today in some form or fashion. But you made it your life work. You wrote the book Unconscious Racial Bias in Schools, which is your attempt to get to those educators and to teach them that they have biases, whether they know it or not. And you talk about in that book, you were a principal and you found yourself with a bias. Would you mind sharing that story where you talked about the kids congregating in the hallway?
Yeah, I mean, we all have biases, so we have to understand that in society, that the ways in which we receive stimuli, whether through television, whether it's through who our parents keep in their social group, right? We're often very racially isolated. That folks that we have contact with very early on in our close social circles as kids are often folks who have the same racial backgrounds as their parents, especially if you're a white person, right? If you say you grew up in a community that's 95% white, it's highly unlikely that you have had a very close black friend within your family circle, or you yourself have had a close black friend. So most of the stuff that folks learn about other races is through the media, right? And media is full of racial biases, right? Especially negative racial biases for people of color, right? And so we have all ingested, including people of color, because I am subject to the same stimuli as the rest of white America, right? So it's not unknown that people of color also ingest same racial biases and can act them out on other people. And so this was a case, and this has been proven a number of times in terms of how we all absorb racial biases. And the most seminal case is the doll study by Kenneth and Mamie Clark. Back in the I think it's the 60s. And if you don't know about this kid, maybe you do, but the folks listening, if they don't know about this study, it's two black psychologists that wanted to study how young that racial biases appear in kids, right? So what they did is they took a group of 5-year-olds, right, half white, half black, and they took them one at a time and brought them into a room and gave them a choice of dolls to play with. Do you want to play with these black dolls, or do you want to play with this white doll? And what they found that regardless of the race of the race of the kid, the 5-year-old, the kid more often chose the white doll over the black doll. So kids as young as 5 years old prefer white skin over black skin. Right, in dolls. And when they were asked to describe what these dolls, the characteristics of the dolls, they described the white doll as looking nice, as looking clean, and looking friendly. And then they described the black doll as looking mean, as looking dirty, as looking unfriendly. Right. So they have learned that black skin signifies these negative thoughts and negative beliefs. And so we all absorb racial biases. So that in my case, it's played out a number of times. So I have my own work to do as well. And the case that you're referring to was when I was a principal in a high school in Western Massachusetts. And I was monitoring the hallway. So the school needed to be turned around. We needed to really decrease the number of hallway disruptions, increase the likelihood of students from making to class on time. So I was a big stickler on teachers being in the hallway during passing time, and I was whatever I did, whenever that bell rang, whatever I was doing, I'd drop whatever I was doing and go out into the hallway and monitor the halls. And so, since we had a really old school building with not the largest hallways, we had a lot of students, we had to keep the traffic flow moving because when the traffic flow slowed down, you have a higher propensity for there to be problems, right? And so, you got to keep the traffic flow moving. So, part of what I would do is I walk, snake down the hallways, and whenever I see a congregation of students gathering, I'd be like, all right, guys, you got to move, you got to be on your way, keep it moving, right? Because I don't want there to be any problems if you stop in the hallways because that's when trouble then kicks off. And so, I was monitoring the hallway one day, and after I was done, I came into my office, and one of my students, Derek, came in shortly after. He didn't go to class. He's like, I need to pass back to class, but I'd like to talk to you about something, Mr. Benson. And I'm like, oh, what is it, Derek? He's like, Derek, and Derek is like, why do you pick on the black kids in the hallway? I'm like, what? I was like, what do you mean pick on the black kids in the hallway? He's like, yeah, when we're congregating in the hallway, you tend to come and pick on us, and you don't pick on the white kids who are doing the same thing, right? And at this point, often administrators will say, I don't do that, dismiss it, you're just being silly, go back to class and not think anything other of it. But I was like, all right, well, thank you for sharing that with me, Derek. I will pay more attention to see if I do this. And so what I did for the next week is I didn't address any student in the hallway. I just went and stood in the hallway on the different, we have 3 floors. At each floor, I changed a floor each period and just watched teachers, right? And what I noticed was that what Derek was saying was true. That students, I watched the hallway, and yes, there were students congregating in the hallway. But when there was a group of black students that was 2 or more congregated in the hallway, you would see a teacher leave their door, walk over, pass by white students who were doing the same behavior directly towards those black students and say, you guys need to move along, get going, right? And then often walk past those white students doing the same thing back to their door, right? And I was like, oh my goodness, I am probably doing the same thing. I had never noticed that before. And so I made a conscious change in my behavior the next week, in that I would start at one end of the hallway, and whenever I would walk down, I would clear the first group of students that I saw and keep going down the hallway. We didn't have that many students who congregated, but I would make sure that I would address each one of the congregating students. And what I noticed was, and I knew that I was being biased before, because when I started addressing the white students, they got upset. Because there was a culture of privilege in the school building, and I was supporting that. Right. I was unconsciously supporting that. If they congregate, they're of no trouble. They're not going to cause any trouble. I need to look for the black kids. And so I started changing my behavior, and they got upset with this. But I also addressed it with the leadership team that, this is something I noticed. I'm doing it too. Let's change our behavior. And so we did. And what I often noticed as well is when I started clearing white congregations of students, by the time I would actually get to the black congregation of students, they were gone already, because they saw me. They're like, oh my gosh, he's even clearing white students. Let's get out of here because we're next, right?
That's right.
And so, yeah, it was true. I was guilty of racial bias against the black kids in my building, unconsciously. And it's not until Derek told me. And it could have been very easy for me to say, Derek, get out of my office, you're being silly. But instead I was like, no, let me investigate this. And it, in fact, was happening. And it changed the culture in our hallways. We had less disruptions out of many students in the hallway because the black students were being treated as second-class citizens, and they were often, getting into arguments with teachers because what they were seeing was correct, but no one was believing them, right? And so they could be written up for insubordination. And once we implemented that practice, that really changed the dynamic, and we had far less hallway disruptions.
It's so interesting. That's just when I think back to my high school days, I could definitely see, the lunchroom had a table that had all black boys, because it was all boys school, and then the rest of but it was pocketed. And if there was a food fight, or if there was something, I remember, and maybe I'm making it up now that I'm doing it, but I remember it being like they started it, even though everybody was throwing the Strombolis across the lunchroom. It didn't seem to stick to the white kids quite the same way. I don't know. The beginning of your book talks a lot about, and it kind of fits with the Celebrate the Gray. It's basically your racist, non-racist binary. If someone sees themselves as, I'm not like, the guys burning crosses on lawns, I'm not outwardly, I'm not racist. They see themselves as zero racist, where it's really a spectrum. And again, a lot of it's unbiased, so it's hard to put a number to it. But it seems to be kind of the basis of what your book's about and your work's about, is getting people to realize that just because you're not the worst of the worst, you're not squeaky clean. Care to comment on that a little bit?
Yeah, I mean, we have to understand that first we've been raised in a heavily racially biased society where racism still plays out. It's all around us. It's normalized. It's the way in which we function currently, right? And not unless we actively work against it, we can't call ourselves an effective anti-racist or even a non-racist, because that just simply doesn't exist. You can't live in a racist society and be neutral, because that doesn't exist. It only takes just a little bit to scratch below the surface to realize that race plays a really important part in our lives, and we make a lot of decisions around race. And most Americans, especially white Americans, make a lot of decisions about where to live, in part based on race, where they send their kids to school, in part based on race, and where they work and who they hire at their jobs, right? So these are decisions that aren't all the way based in race, but race definitely has something to do with it. And so that's just a little bit below the surface. And we have to realize, like, I do live in an area where, I want to live around, white folks, because I have this trope around Black and brown communities that they're dangerous, right? And my property value is going to suffer. And so that's why we remain so intensely segregated. But in terms of like the good non-racist, bad racist binary, this is something that Robin DiAngelo talks about, but the forefather of that is Janice Helms. She writes about the racial identity development continuum, but also talks about the good racist, the bad racist, the good non-racist binary. And this is the belief, just like you say, that if I am considered, the way in which I validate my good non-racism or my good anti-racism is that I'm able to identify the racists over there, right? Oh, I see who the bad racists are. These are the folks who burn flags, burn crosses, who fly this particular flag, who wear masks, who are part of white supremacist, anti-American groups. Those are the racists. And as long as I'm not that, I am not racist at all, right? And so you're looking at the very extreme end of racism, and I'm not doing that. Or even the closer end, like I have a Black friend,
Right.
so hence I am not racist, right? And that is like that's my validate that I am a good non-racist, white person. But what we have to understand that there's gradations of racial identity development, that everyone is adjusted racial bias. And the big part of the problem about being this good non-racist is we want to talk about, a lot of folks want to be these good liberal non-racists, right? Meaning that they cannot interact with those bad racists over there, right? They just need them to change and be more like us because they're closed-minded and we're open-minded. But the catch-22 in that is that by demonizing them and saying that they need to be more like you, that is the definition of closed-mindedness. So a lot of these liberal, left-wing, folks who want to be anti-racist are the most closed-minded people you'll meet. Because they believe they're absolutely right, and if other people are just like them, that the world would be a better place. Which I argue the world won't be a better place because you are closed-minded, because you think you have the answer. And so the idea here, and even for me, I do not have the right answer. I am always open to being wrong or learning more, right? And I'm not the bastion of what anti-racism is, because that would make me a closed-minded person. So what we have to understand on the end of the good non-racist and the bad racist is that there is no binary, that everyone needs to learn from each other. And the closer we can get to talking through our differences, we'll find that we have a lot of the same wishes, dreams, and purposes in life. We just have not had opportunity to talk about where we move together as a collective. And that's what's going on with us today in the society, is that we've polarized especially along political lines, about we're just not going to talk with you guys are over here, the liberal snowflakes over here, but you guys are the racist white supremacists over here, and we can never interact. And that's the way you divide a country, and that's the way that we don't learn together. But if we could see each other of having different ideologies, different backgrounds, and different beliefs, but a way that we can learn from one another and find that if we talk enough, we can actually gain empathy for the other person's position. In
Yeah.
point in case, I've made it I made a conscious effort to learn about folks who are politically different than mine, especially politically different ideologically around race, right? That, I've learned by watching certain news channels and often talking to folks who are supporters of different political positions than myself. And so what I've learned was, especially for those who feel like, and this is the trope that I hear all the time, that black and brown folks are criminals, that immigrants are coming in and taking all of our jobs,
Mm-hmm.
that Muslims hate Americans, that Blue Lives Matter, and that Black Lives, by saying Black Lives Matter, that you were discounting white lives, that white people are losing stake in society. That all these tropes that white folks are victims in society, right?
Mm-hmm.
That's the reason why we have this position of not liking people of color. And I've learned from these people. And what I learned is that the essential emotion driving their behavior is a sense of loss.
Hmm.
That's a pure emotion. And how could
Mm-hmm.
you not empathize with that, right?
Yeah.
I could easily put them in the box of hate, of bigotry, of racism, and I'm not talking with you and I dislike you. But let me pull myself closer to you to really understand where you're coming from. And the essential emotion I get is loss. And I can understand loss. And
Mm-hmm.
so how do we better learn from each other that we have some of the same desires and wishes in society, but we just have differences of opinion. If we both have that, both sides, if there are sides, have a generosity of spirit and perspective, I think that could bring us closer if we just talk about our differences in very real ways.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. The loss. I've always kind of seen it as fear, but it's probably fear of loss, fear of something different, a fear of losing a comfort of some. You don't. The past is always, romanticized versus the future being, scary. You don't know what's coming next, so it's easier to look in the past and say, those were the good old days, or those were. But I think the thing I've really learned through the little bit of research that I've been able to do recently is the good old days weren't so good for a lot of people.
Yeah,
A lot of people.
a lot
and
of
I don't
people.
think the good old days were necessarily as good as, even white people would think were thinking they were. I don't know.
Right.
I want to get into some specifics as it more towards the K-12 education that you teach and research, kind of locally here. So you teach at UNC Charlotte. I'm 5 minutes down the road. I live in the same zip code as UNC Charlotte. And our local schools, University City, the area that we're in right now, where I live in and the school is in, is about 50%. Where are we? I'm sorry. About 40% white. And then, which is a more diverse area than most of the rest of Charlotte. But when I went to look at the high schools, my son, his senior year of high school, decided to go to the local high school because he wanted to play football. And he goes into it, and we're looking at it, and he's the only white kid in all of his classes. So I looked a little further, and I think there were 6 white kids who graduated that year, the same as he did. So looking at the numbers, he went to Julius Chambers, which was Vance High School at the time. There, as of right now, there's 50 white children out of 2,000, which is 2.4%. Mallard Creek High School is a little higher, but still 197 white children out of 2,200 kids, which is about 8.6%. When I look at the local charter schools, and I'm getting to a question, I promise. Lake Norman Charter is 63% white. Corvian Charter is 67.5%, and Bradford Prep is 50%. Is the public school, basically the public school isn't representative of the population of University City.
I mean, that's clear. And I think it more is in elementary ages and kind of disperses as you get older and older. But I've had this theory rolling around in my head, and I don't think I made it up. I think I'd heard it somewhere. But is the charter school system a new form of segregated schools? Is my long-winded question.
Yes. Next question.
and I look at it as you have a limited transportation, which means a parent's going to have to take kids to school. Minority students typically have parents that have two jobs, and everything's setting up towards taking a kid to a charter school seems to be a move towards segregated schools. And also in the circles that I'm in, I know the thinking of people who are in this demographic of sending their kids to charter school. And I have to throw myself into that demographic because I homeschool my kids, partly because of the demographics of CMS schools. So I'll leave you to comment on that.
Yes, and I no longer work at UNCC, and I no longer live in the city.
Oh,
I
I'm
live
sorry.
in Lexington, Kentucky, right now. No,
okay,
that's great because I'm gonna speak freely, all right? Because folks don't know where I live, right? And so I do research on school segregation, right? So this is part of my research agenda, and we have to understand the origins of school choice. It goes back to 1954. 1954 is the Brown versus Board decision. And that's when we got into these discussions about choice. Like there should be choice. Like we should have an open enrollment system and where we can choose to send our kids to school instead of the neighborhood school thing, because white parents want the opportunity to send their kids to white schools. And this residual of that initial turn towards we want to keep because a lot of public school districts just simply could not resist. And Charlotte CMS holds himself up as the prodigy of what school integration looked like, right? The busing, and being one of the first to really implement a unitary system where we could no longer identify schools by the racial designation, which I think was a point in time that could be celebrated, but Charlotte still has this residual of seeing itself that way, which it is not. It is a highly segregated city, and with the gentrification going on in and around uptown and on the different sides of town, it's becoming a more hyper segregated residential area. In places, I have my wife has an aunt and uncle who live off of Beatty's Ford Road, a little south of that, and the gentrification is just spreading rapidly. Right there, they live in a traditionally black area, right? And they couldn't, and as long as I've known them, which has been almost 20 years now, the neighborhood's been all black. But as of 5 years ago, we saw a bike lane go in. We're like, oh, what that means to black folks is that white folks are coming, right? Yeah. And so, the uptown area and certain areas of town have gotten so expensive that now the gentrification is moving north, right? And what that means is that white folks are moving in, increasing the property value because it's a more desirable area, right? Before, with all black folks, it's not desirable, so the property value stays low. But as soon as white folks move in, move in a bike lane from the city, you open a coffee shop here or there, and then the property value goes up, pushing the folks who've always lived there. They can't afford the property tax anymore, and you have someone come in with this angel amount of money to buy your house, and then you get bought out, and then you have to move further out to the exurbs, right? So you're pushed out of the city. And so that's actually going on in Charlotte right now. And the charter system is part and parcel to understanding the ebb and flow of the racial dynamics of a city. And so this happens in all major cities that allow charter schools, is that they choose one of two ways. There's often charter schools that don't just lie in the middle, like we're going to create a racially integrated charter school, because it'll never survive. Right? Because school districts are so segregated. So you have one or two ways that I've seen it in my research, is that you have charter schools who open up as elite schools, i.e. like Norman Charter School, right? They open up as an elite prep academy, knowing that they're open, they want to draw in the middle to high income, white family that's willing to leave CMS and maybe can save some money, not send their kids to private school, but you can have a private public school if you put your school in a particular location and you market to that group.
Mm-hmm.
The other brand of charter schools are ones that capitalize on low-income Black and Brown communities that we're going to open as a big box school. So the KIPP academies, the Achievement First academies, the Aspira academies that open up smack in the middle of low-income areas where their local schools are either rated a D or an F school, and we're going to draw in students to our school, not in a way that's a true lottery, but students who are already at the cusp of being proficient. We're going to draw you into our school to enhance our brand and our model, so that we can draw from the local school. Into our school and sort of profiteer from that. So we have to understand that often the schools that all charter schools, one is an industry, even though they exist on partially public dollars, but it's still an industry that
Mm-hmm.
people make a lot of money and get paid large amounts of revenue for catering to certain populations, giving them what they need. But I don't think that charter schools are the answer to school segregation. I believe they make them intensely worse.
Yeah. And I anecdotally, or just from a peripheral vision standpoint, I see that. It's just, I know where people are sending their kids and why they're sending their kids there. And again, I'm guilty of it too. Because we had a choice. Now my wife loves the idea of homeschooling. You mentioned, there's a TED talk that you say you play at the beginning of all your classes, that I just finished listening to about 5 minutes before we started the interview, but kind of tearing down the walls of school and kind of giving kids more flexibility. And that was her vision once she got into homeschooling, and kind of why she stayed in that way rather than going into traditional schooling. I think I'm trying to honor your time. So I have a couple more things that I wanted to get into. I think where I want to go with you is with media.
Mm-hmm.
If you can bear with me, I'm going to read a quote from your own book back to you. But
Okay.
I stopped, I got your audio book, and I'm, slowing it down and listening to it. And I heard this and it just stopped me in my tracks, and I'll explain a little why, but I'm going to read it out and then we'll go from there. He said it, and I'm quoting from the book. If you're listening to this and you're white, seeing people who look like you in mass media may not be something that you often think about. Every day, the culture reflects not only you, but nearly infinite variations of you. Executives, poets, garbage collectors, soldiers, nurses, and so on. The world shows you that your possibilities are boundless. Those of us who are not white have considerably more trouble finding any representations of ourselves in mass media and other arenas of public life, let alone representation that indicates that our humanity is multifaceted. Relating to characters on screen is necessary not merely for us to be seen and understood, but also for others who need to see us and understand us. When it doesn't happen, we are all poorer for it. I had a conversation. I watch a lot of TV. I watched a lot of TV growing up, movies. It's just kind of how I related to the world. And I interviewed a man last week named Joe Gupperlet, who's a gay man, and he talked about, he knew he was gay when in middle school, very early on.
Mm-hmm.
And the only thing he had to see in media and shows were like flamboyantly, stylish, gay men. And he was like, I don't fit that way. And so it was after I interviewed him where I read this, and I'm like, wow, when I was growing up, I had Leave It to Beaver, and I had Saved by the Bell, and I had, just multitudes of different kinds of shows and people, and, Nickelodeon and Disney and whatever. And like, I had my pick of things. When it came to the media that I remember for Black people that had Black people in it, it was The Cosby Show, of course. But then, growing up, it was like, I got into gangster rap and Menace to Society and Boys in the Hood and I guess Will Smith, Fresh Prince of Bel-Air, I guess, was more wholesome, but it seemed to be more leaning that way. So kind of where I'm going, it is helpful when you have lots of examples in the media to be able to say, hey, that's me. That's somebody else who looks like me, acts like me. I'm not weird. I can be normal. Is that comments on that? Thoughts on that?
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we have to understand, again, the legacy of white supremacy in our country, right? Whites right now in 2020 represent a little over 60% of the population,
Mm-hmm.
right? And white men, I mean, we could speculate it's not exactly half because there's always more women in any race than there are men. And so we speculate that say 28% of the US population are white men. And then we think about all the superheroes that we know of.
Mm-hmm.
I would venture to say that the upwards of 85 to 90% of superheroes are white men. Right.
Mm-hmm.
And you talk about protagonists in major movies, dramas, actions. Actually, where has a male protagonist, I would say that's even higher, like 95% are white men, right? But this is 28% of the population, right? And they're overrepresented in all of these areas. And so to see that as the normalized way of being, like I can always see myself in the media, and we're thinking about newscasters, we're thinking about coaches, we're thinking about in sports. There's always been this presence of an overrepresentation of white males in our society in positions of power. And so we have to understand that what that does to the psyche of a child and what that does to the psyche of young adults growing up in terms of what it means to be someone of power and success is that you need to subscribe to this white male ways of being because you see these people as being in positions of power. And when it's normalized for the folks who are white males, I don't blame folks for not seeing it any differently, right? It was not your choice to put all these people in these places of power and representation, but you were on the receiving end of that, and now we believe that it's normal, right? And so one of my good friends, Eddie Moore, talks about just the legacy and how long we have to go till we right the ship on not just representation, but assumption of positions of power according to our racial demographic, right? Not even surpassing that 60% of folks, who are white own this percentage of power, money, power, and influence. We have a long way to go to get there. And Eddie Moore has this activity that he does. He runs a White Privilege Conference, is he draws a line graph, and he puts 1900 at the beginning, then 1910, 1920, 1930, 1940, and keeps it going all the way up to 2020. And what he does, he's like, all right, I'm going to start at 1900, and I'm going to draw a line. And I want folks in the audience to raise their hand to say at what point in time did the majority of people in power not subscribe to these characteristics. He says white, male, moderately wealthy, landowner, able-bodied, Christian. Those are the characteristics. And he said, at what point in time did the majority of folks who hold power in this country not subscribe to these major characteristics that I've just named? So he starts at 1910, right? It's going, 1920, 1950, 1970, 1980. Then he hits 2000 and when was Barack Obama elected?
2008.
2008. Someone always raise their hand. Barack Obama. And like, all right, is he a majority? It's like, no. All right, okay. Oh, never mind. And then we keep going. So this legacy of who's had been in positions of power and influence in our country has been sort of a monolith of folks over time. But then, it creates this normalcy of who is seen as a position of authority and power. And so when we write that chapter on just the normalcy of the exclusion of folks who aren't white, but also who aren't white men, it's very prolific in the ways in which it functions in our society. And we're not going to solve it tomorrow, but recognizing that is the first step, and then figuring out how to track backwards so more folks are represented and included in a society that we claim to be the melting pot.
But then you run into that. I keep hearing this in different forms and fashions, and I think it was in one of the things that I listened to of yours was basically to white men in particular, equality looks like oppression. That they're losing, you're losing ground. So you have that to fight against as you're moving forward.
And that's the essential sense of loss, right? You have, so uber comfort. I remember, because I hear folks, I remember a time where we didn't even have to talk about race. That was a sense of comfort. You're gonna miss that. I totally get that, right? You had a chance where
Hmm.
white supremacy was so powerful that you didn't even have to talk about race. Right.
Yeah.
But now, unfortunately, if we are a country that's progressive, you're going to have to lose that comfort. And the thing is, it won't be perpetually uncomfortable to learn how to talk about race, but you might lose the ability to say, you know what, I just don't care about people of color, and I'm not going to talk about it. It's a loss.
Yeah. I was with a friend the other day he's at a larger corporate company here in Charlotte, and mentioned that he was talking about how they had a female CEO, and they were like, we were kind of on the cutting edge of that. I was like, when did she become CEO? I was like, I think he said 2015, 2016. And I was like, I'm pretty sure women have been around just about as long as men have. It's not very. It didn't seem very cutting edge that 2015 was their and the company had been around since about 1912 or in some form or fashion. So I don't know. So it is
Yeah.
just the mindset of that is we're cutting edge, but it's we've had inequality for so long. It's not really cutting edge. It's moving in the right direction, maybe.
Right. And the flash forward, like, all right, 2015, and we're going to have a female, CEO for the next 70 years. Like, that's progressive, right? We have one, and we're going to continue to have one.
Right. No, I tend to give the people I interview an opportunity at the end just to answer a question that I didn't ask. Is there something that I didn't ask that you want to make sure people know or understand?
Well, I have a question for you. I mean, I'd be great to get. I mean, I always want to understand the impetus. So, I get requests to come on to shows all the time, and I always want to know the impetus. Like, what was the spark? Because you're a 43-year-old man with 8 kids, and you came to some sort of epiphany at some point in time, and you decided that you didn't have to, reach out and say, I want you to come on my show. So, what is the impetus, and what do you hope, like, the impact of a show like this is in this particular episode?
I have I heard this somewhere else, and I mentioned in one of my other podcasts, I use the actual quote, but I think through conversation and stories and seeing people face to face, that a lot of the issues that we have that divide us as a country break down. And you mentioned it earlier with it creates empathy. It's easy to say, this guy stole this and he went to jail and he deserved to be there. It'd be different if you were in the courtroom when he was talking about, needing to feed his children, and now they're going into the foster system because he's going to jail. And, and it's just, whatever. And in my picture, I'm making that a white guy. So just, but it's easier to say he's a criminal, he deserves to be punished, versus he was desperate and he was just trying to do what he could to get through life, because life's hard, So I think the more people that you see and talk to, and you realize that it's not black and white. He's not just a criminal; he's a dad, And in there is the gray that I'm talking about in the title. So the more conversations you can have about it, and it really came down to kind of my origin story. Started on this podcast after the 2016 election, really, where I realized that everything I was listening to and following, the some of the Christian people I was following, the political people I was following, it was all pushing me in a direction and putting things in my head to really see other people as other. And it just kind of, when that election happened, and I just kind of looked around and I was like, man, what are we doing? And then I was seeing into my own head of like, I've gotten to a point and I don't even know how I've gotten here. Like just by listening to things and absorbing it, and through osmosis, I'm believing things that I don't believe. And I'm, and so it's just kind of been a breakdown of all that, to say there's other sides to this and I need to hear them. Which is when I started listening to lots of podcasts and reading books and talking to whoever I can talk to just gather more information and get more stories and get a better understanding. I know actually the 1619 podcast was a big one that kind of opened me up to at least this conversation, which was, I thought it was very well done and opened my eyes to and, Point Lookout. I've been there. There's a fort there, and I didn't realize the significance of being there until I listened to that, and I was like, oh my God, I walked there. And that's where slavery started in this world, or started in this country. So I don't know. It's just, I think through having conversations and talking to people and meeting people that we can get a better understanding and be less divided, because I don't think we're as divided as it's really as it seems. So I don't know.
Wonderful. Well, kudos to you, and congratulations on taking that step, because it's not easy, to change our perspective on what we think we believe, right? It was a hard journey for me to dive down that well hole of white supremacy. I was like, I don't want to do it, but I have to learn, right? I want to be this good anti-racist over here doing my job, but I don't want to learn about them. But, and I think this is a great sort of bridge to bring folks to a space where we realize that, we're not being our best selves. And we need to do more and learn about the people we see as other to be better. And so kudos to you for doing this, and thanks for bringing me on. This has been a very joyous conversation.
Oh, good. Well, I feel like I have the easy part. I do get some, my wife does some controversial stuff in air quotes, on her podcast. And I've talked about it, and it was like, people are like, you're so brave. I was like, I'm just sitting here talking behind a microphone in my bedroom. Like, this isn't brave. I'm not on the front lines of some of this stuff like other people like you and many other people. So I don't know. It's just talking. So no, I appreciate you. Appreciate you joining me, and I wish you luck in all your endeavors. Are you still teaching right now? Are you still teaching?
I run what's called the Anti-Racist Leadership Institute. And so I love teaching. I love working with school leaders. And so when I was in the leadership program at UNCC, that was the love, was doing that and writing and researching. And so I chose to leave there out of racism. Yeah, it hit me hard at UNCC as someone who studies racism. Yeah. I left, but I sort of created my own institute, and I work with school leaders and district leaders and college and university leaders around anti-racism. And so I love this work, and I do it under my own brand, under Tracey Benson Consulting.
Cool. And I'll link all that to the show notes. And so if anybody's interested in working with or learning more about Dr. Benson, Mr. Benson, we will, all that information will be out there. So I really appreciate it.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve. It was great talking to you.
Great talking to you.
I hope you enjoyed that interview with Dr. Tracey Benson. It was a conversation worth having and a conversation worth continuing. So look for more of that from Celebrate the Gray in the future. I don't know if you knew this, but Celebrate the Gray podcast and Celebrate Story podcast has a Instagram page, Celebrate Podcasts. If you search that in your Instagram, go ahead and give us a follow. And if you do, we are running a promotion for Celebrate Story. Julie Wagner, my wife, who hosts the Celebrate Story podcast, just completed a series called What is the Church?, where she interviewed 3 fairly prominent Christian authors who have been doing some deconstructing, some thinking, some wondering on what the church looks like now and what it should look like going forward into the future. They were great interviews, and we are running a promotion that if you share any of those episodes on your social media, or you can even screenshot a text you send to a friend about the Celebrate Story podcast, and you can email that screenshot to celebratestorypod@gmail.com. You get entered into a random drawing where you will win all 3 books from the authors that Julie interviewed. That's A Church Called Tove by Laura Barringer, The Other Half of Church with Michael Hendricks, and Do I Stay Christian by Brian McLaren. It's about $60, $70 value of books. So it's a really good treasure trove of information and some great new writings that are coming out about where we're going as a Christian church and where the church needs to change and where it needs to get better. So again, you can share any of those episodes on your social media and tag Julie Wagner. You can find her information at celebratestorypod.com, all of her social media, and just tag her. Or again, you can send a screenshot to our email address and you will be entered into the sweepstakes to win the books. Thank you for listening, and we'll talk to you soon.